Thank you for that introduction. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to say a big thank you to Gerald and the team at Vic Health and the other partners who put on the event today for inviting us. We've actually had the privilege of working with Vic Health now for many years, one of our first partners here in Australia, and actually doing a lot of work around diet and obesity and sugar. And Vic Health, and on a sidetrack and go too far down this road, but Vic Health, I think, has always been at the forefront and helped us push boundaries in terms of public policy issues. And actually, as part of the work that we did in this area, Vic Health ran a citizens' jury, which actually tested what is the public's reaction to things like a sugar tax. It also ran trials here in Victoria to work out what did that do to consumer demand. And that directly fed into the introduction of the sugar tax in the UK, which has just come in, and we are already seeing products being reformulated. So we don't even need to choose a different drink, but our drinks are getting healthier, partly as a result of the work done here in Victoria. So I think it is worth acknowledging that work done here has a global impact, and I believe that this area is another one where Victoria can lead the way. As Nelly mentioned, we sort of are focused on what does the evidence from the behavioural sciences tell us about why people do what they do. And there's a huge amount of research in more than 60 years, and so we try to boil that down into very practical tools, frameworks, and trials for policymakers. So in essence, if you take away one thing about how do you try and influence people's behaviour, we have this framework EAST, which is make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. And so that's the question here around bystanding or upstanding. How do we make it easy, attractive, social, and timely for people to intervene when they see these types of behaviours? And I'll talk through very briefly what does behavioural insights mean, and particularly what that might mean for gender equality. And then, as stated, Nikki, who leads our work around bystanding in this area more broadly, is going to talk about the sort of specifics in the space, as she knows far more about the specific evidence here. So I'll just start off with a broad introduction to what is behavioural insights. And again, can I just get a sort of show of hands if you've heard and have sort of applied behavioural insights in your workplace? So it's great, good, nearly half of you. So I won't spend too long on this. But essentially, at its core, is trying to understand how do we make the decisions that we make. And probably one of the sort of leading thinkers of this is Danny Kahneman, a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he drew on that dual process theory about how we make decisions, about system one thinking and system two thinking. System one is a sort of automatic part of our brain that drives a lot of our daily decision making, and system two is that more reflective part of our brain, which uses quite a lot of sort of cognitive energy, so quite often we substitute that for system one. And unfortunately, although system one has evolved over many, many years and allows us to live our daily lives, it also trips us up. And so if you see on this sort of left-hand side as you're looking of the slide here, there are a number of predictable biases that we fall into. So for example, we over-focus on the present, and despite the best will in our world of wanting to diet or save or whatever it might be, we often don't follow through. And I often sort of say that and make jokes about myself, that I'm very, very good at going for a run tomorrow or saving more tomorrow or eating healthily tomorrow. I'm not very good at doing that in the moment. But the same must apply in gender equality and bystanding. In my head, I would like to think that when I saw this and when this happened, that I would speak up, I would intervene, I would take the necessary action. The likelihood is that I might not. There might be contextual factors around that which make it less likely that I would be. And it's also the point that's been made, this is challenging. We are all, as human beings, or many of us, are over-optimistic, we are overconfident, and so we will probably overestimate the likelihood with which we will follow through. So it's not just as simple as saying, can we just educate people to do that? We need to think through, as was highlighted, what are the systems that are in place and how do we change the environment so it makes it more likely that we do follow through? So Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, who wrote Nudge, that really put this book on the sort of policymakers' map for the first time in the late 2000s, they talk about choice architecture. So all of our legislation, all of our workplaces, there is no neutral way of setting up your workplace or your pension scheme. We do, all of those require decisions, and we can either do that in ways which leads to good outcomes or bad outcomes. So again, I want to over-obsess on the food environment, but they use the example of a school canteen. There is no neutral way to set that up. So why don't we set it up in a way that makes it more likely you have the healthy food at the front and kids are more likely to pick that up? Again, the same is true in our workplaces and around gender equality. And actually, it's really hard work to sort of train yourself out of some of those biases. So I know, and again, this was a real sort of learning point for me, is I'm quite happy to admit all of these biases which I'm subject to in my personal life. I find it harder in my professional life. And when we created a tool called Applied, which effectively tries to de-bias recruitment, it took a while for me to get my head around that. I'd always been quite proud of my record. I would like to think I recruit good people. I say, look, it might affect other people, but I'm very progressive. And if you just give me their CVs and an interview, I'll be fine. You know, I'm not subject. Of course, that's not true. Of course, I am. And so we have tried to create these tools now which change the way that organizations recruit so that you don't see, for example, people's CVs or their genders or their race or their age, that just ask them work-based tasks so that you make decisions based on who is best for the job rather than all of those other factors that might influence your decision-making. And the question is, how do we do this around bystanding? Again, I don't think it's easy. As Nikki and others I think we'll talk about later on, there are things we think that you can do which makes things like reporting more easier. It makes it more likely that people will intervene and stand up. So that's one of the themes that we'll take away. What are the ways we can change the choice architecture to promote that? I would just sort of make the point as well that this is based on sort of empirical findings about human behaviour, and it enables us to sharpen those traditional tools of government. Again, when we first were set up and the sort of nudge agenda came on in the late 2000s, I think we were sort of almost slightly dismissive of the sort of clunky old tools of government. This was the new shiny thing, the sort of new magic nudge toolbox, and you know, don't worry about price incentives or taxation and regulation that we've always used in government. It's become pretty clear as we've gone on that if you want to tackle any of the really wicked problems and really deep problems, you're going to need to use those traditional tools of government, but you need to use them in a more behaviourally informed way. So I think what Behavioural Insights does is to think about what is our legislation, what are the way that we're using these traditional tools, as well as giving us a set of new tools, which, again, we'll briefly touch on this morning. And in order to sort of address gender inequality, our sort of argument is then that you need to address the environments and structures, and particularly the social norms, those sort of subtle influences on all of our behaviour which prevent sexism and sexual harassment. And again, we know that it's important, and we've highlighted that there'll be data coming out about attitudes and belief, and that is a really important part of the picture for us to stand. We focus specifically on the behavioural part of that. So how does that translate into behaviours? How do we actually measure changes that are going on in terms of reporting and other things? And that's where, again, when Nikki talks through, a lot of our focus will be. And again, there'll be a range of those behaviours that we're trying to identify to work out, are we making a difference? Because again, the sad fact of government is, with the best will in the world, we fund billions of dollars in very worthy and evidence-based or built on evidence that we think will make a difference that doesn't. And we often don't evaluate it. And sometimes we will actively be doing harm. And we know that that also happens in the gender equality space. We know some forms of training, which are very well-meaning, can backfire. So how do we run trials to make sure that we are building the evidence to find out what actually works in practice? And so finally, before I hand over to Nikki, who's going to talk about the work here in Victoria with our partners, if you're interested in the sort of broader work the team is doing on this, we're doing some work in the UK. Again, really lucky to be collaborating with some of Vic Health's collaborators, including Professor Iris Bonnet at Harvard and the Government Equalities Office, to, again, try and build that evidence base about what actually works. So we're looking at everything from shared parental leave and how do we try and encourage things like flexible working, right through to sort of more overt discrimination in the workplace. So I'll leave it there and hand over to Nikki, who's going to talk about the work we're doing here in Victoria around bystanding. Thanks.